A touch after 7, this is News at Prime with me, Timbekile Mkhototo. Power utility Eskom has published its expected load shedding schedule for this coming week, hoping to ease from stage 5 to stage 3 power cuts from Monday. But it's warned that higher stages could be implemented at rather short notice. It's dealing at the moment with diesel supply constraints, it says. Let's focus on the power crisis in the country. We're joined now by different stakeholders, if you will. James Lorimer is the DA Shadow Minister for Mineral Resources. Mpumelelo Zikalala is a legal analyst. He'll join us shortly via video link. We also have with us Clyde, Mallisson, who is an energy expert, also with me in studio today. And Clyde, I think let's begin with you and talk about where we are now, the stages. We've gone more frequently than ever from 3, 4, 5 and 6. Have things ever been this bad?
No.
Never. Why? What has changed? What has shifted in South Africa's ability to deal with load shedding?
The prediction of where we would be at the moment is exactly as predicted about 3 years ago. So nothing's shifted. What's happened, the problem is that nothing meaningful has been done over the last 3 years. That's the big problem.
James, politically, why has nothing meaningful been done?
That's the big question, isn't it? We've had load shedding for 14 years, and we're still stuck with this. In fact, it's getting worse. It's had a huge effect on the mining industry, which is massive. Provides a livelihood for probably well over 4 million South Africans. And a lot of those jobs are now in peril because of where we are with this load shedding, particularly for stage 5 and 6.
And Clyde, you mentioned 14 years now, 2008, the first taste of these blackouts and then the coining of the term load shedding. This past week, we've had the former President Thabo Mbeki talk about how failure of leadership is to blame for where we are. But he was among the leaders when the first alarm bells were sounded about this crisis. Are you able to take us back to what was the conversation then and why everything that's been done has so far been ineffective as far as addressing it?
We were actually lucky from 2008 onwards. You remember we had the crash in the global financial sector with Freddie Mac and Fannie Mae, I think it was. And were it not for that crash, we would probably be sitting where we're sitting now in 2010, 2011. So it gave us reprieve. But then the pressure built up again, and then along came COVID. And we had another chance to reprieve. So we had 2 chances to put substitutes from the bench into the power sector, and we missed them both. They both slipped by us like ghosts in the night.
And is Eskom's leadership purely to blame for that? Because that's been the sense, at least from the likes of the Minerals Minister, Gweta Mandasha, this week, Clyde, that, you know, if Eskom had done its bit at a management level, they should have been able to weather the storm.
Now, I would argue that it's not due to Eskom leadership. It's due to inaction at a political level in terms of putting the necessary replacements in place to allow the coal fleet to gradually wind down, not stop tomorrow, gradually wind down, but you can't get rid of your old car when you're a travelling salesman till you've bought your new car. So we basically didn't build the new that would have allowed us to sequentially and systematically shut down the old. And therefore we find ourselves lurching from one crisis to another, trying to plug the gaps now, instead of overseeing a planned phasing out of the existing system.
Mm-hmm. And I want to bring up something for you here, James, from the President's address yesterday, speaking on Heritage Day. He said this: as South Africans, we have done it in the past, we've persevered, and I ask once again, let us persevere. The challenge is being addressed. It's a complex one.
We've heard that before, haven't we? Time and time again, and nothing's happened. So you have to ask why nothing's happening.
But do you think there'll be anything by way of real accountability? I mean, the Sunday Times today is carrying a report that there's wholesale agreement in Cabinet that the Eskom board has to go. Would that be adequate as a first step?
Absolute nonsense. That's not where the blame lies. And you can tell by the way the blame is being shifted that they're not really going to get to grips with this. Blame is being shifted away from Cabinet. Eskom is constrained heavily politically. For example, they can't downsize their staff to an appropriate level. We're told that they're more than twice as many employees as there should be at Eskom. They've been saddled with boards, politically appointed boards, who have been, should we say, not the best for years and years. So to turn around now and blame Eskom is a little bit uncredible.
But on the issue of the workers, I mean, it's interesting that on the one hand, you're told Eskom has too many workers. On the one hand, on the other, Eskom says that it desperately needs more skilled people to come on board. And even at the lower levels, it would, I would suppose, be unfair, wouldn't it, to punish lower-level workers for the sins of management in running it into the ground over successive years?
I think the way to look at it is there are probably too many people who are accounts clerks and there are not enough engineers. That's the basic way of looking at it. That's where they're lacking the skills, the engineers. They've had a lot of skills leave over the years and they haven't replaced them adequately. And yet at the same time, the administration has grown and grown to the point where now it's just unsustainable.
And Clyde, management in the analysis of its failure, especially in recent days, I had on the program the former statistician Badile Hosla, who was saying, we can't get this right when you've got people who are not engineers running a utility such as Eskom. They can't simply begin to understand the complexities of the beast. Do you agree?
Not really. What we need at the moment is the people in the trenches, the artisans and the people who are actually in the trenches fixing the broken equipment. They need to be brought together and told, we're not expecting you to work miracles. We expect you to get 180 terawatt hours out of the coal fleet next year. But the year after that, we're not asking you to push it to 200. We're asking you to give us 160 the next year, and 140 the next year, and 120 the next year. And as you say each of those things, you'll almost see the relief lifting off the shoulders of the workforce to say, we can do this. But when they're told that you're doing shoddy work, you're putting stuff back online when it's not fixed properly, they would say, but we were told, don't worry about the disks, just make sure these new disk pads are on because we can't afford more units to go offline. And so they need the staff. It's down to the people in the trenches now. The generals, if you like, have messed up, and someone's got to go and speak to the troops and say, we can do this, but this is what we need. And that's where we are at the moment. It's got
but are they not the workers fighting a losing battle when you consider just the issues around maintenance, how old the infrastructure is, and that by all forecasts it's going to continue to break down and perhaps become more frequent in terms of breakdowns the older it gets?
Well, of course it will. So imagine how relieved you would be if you told you can scavenge some pieces from this one and put it into this one, because next year we need 10% less out of the fleet, and the next year another 10% less. And it means the guys can say, oh, we can use the steam turbine from Kusile or from Arnott and put it into Camden, and you'll get excitement amongst them. At the moment, they're being asked to do the impossible, and that's where it's so depressing.
How do we reconfigure the running of Eskom at the highest level?
Well, our immediate solution would be to declare a state of emergency around Eskom and ring-fence it, so it's just around Eskom. That would allow government to cut through a lot of the red tape, a lot of the rules and regulations that are adding to the slowness with which the problem is being addressed. I do want to pick up on something a moment ago. We must not underestimate, this is not something that just happened, through oversight. There's a great deal of malice involved in what's going on at Eskom. Eskom has been a crime scene for years and years. People have robbed the place blind. And I find it extraordinary that we had Andre de Ruyter go on television a couple of months ago and relate the story of how he had an accountant who was going through crooked coal contracts, and the guy resigned because his family was threatened. Now that, if I was in government, would have been a signal for me to have thrown the book at it, to have told police intelligence to drop just about everything else and go and make sure that doesn't happen anymore. Because we've all heard the stories about what's happening at Eskom power stations. They're throwing in substandard coal. They're basically throwing stones into those power stations, which of course then break and keep breaking. So until you address that, it's really going to be a losing battle to try and fix all this machinery.
I said earlier we're joined via video link by Mpumelelo Zikalala, legal commentator who's often with us here on Newzroom Afrika. And Mpumelelo, very good evening to you. So we were speaking in the previous hour about the state of South Africa's hospitals and how they too have been impacted by load shedding. And I wonder if it can be proven that a person's the deterioration of one's health and perhaps even them dying in a facility could be directly linked to load shedding, if there'd be a way to perhaps hold government and the Eskom leadership to account.
They could be, depending on whether there's a causal link between the death and the cause and the electricity shortage. So if you can show that at the end of the day, what you ought to have done as government, in this case, from the cabinet ministers to all the individuals that are employed as directors, all the way down to the actual hospital, then you could actually have a claim at the end of the day if you can prove, as stated earlier, the causal link in which I was referring to earlier. But let's start with the directors. Let's remember the Companies Act is very clear in terms of the care, the skills, and the type of precautions in which a director is supposed to apply. So if you are a director at Eskom or a board member, you're then supposed to come back and say to the minister, Minister, I need you to fix the following things in order for us to work optimally. If you are failing to do that, I can be blamed or held personally in my personal capacity, as the Companies Act is saying, because I would have failed in my fiduciary duty in terms of saying so. The same thing would apply to the minister in terms of saying, if you're going to be able to do the work, the oversight work in which you ought to have done, then at the end of the day, we need to hold you accountable. As you've shown when you're going into office, that you're going to do everything that you can to make sure that you're able to take care of us as South Africans in a proper manner. So there are a number of things in which us as South Africans, if you pursue a class action, for example, that you can be able to achieve, the law or the judiciary is there to make sure that it plays a proper oversight authority over the executive and other government departments. And I think what you are doing, we are turning a blind eye and accepting this type of abuse that you are getting from Eskom, and you're not doing anything from the civil society point of view to hold the Eskom executives accountable, to hold the government accountable, and to say to them, our businesses are failing, the healthcare services are failing, other critical services are going to fail because you are failing to fix a problem that you've told us time and time and again for the past decade that it could be fixed, and yet you are failing every single year to come up with principal solutions which will enable us to live a proper lives as South Africans.
And Mpumelelo, with the fact that Eskom basically has a monopoly over energy generation in this country, strengthen such a class action lawsuit if it were to come about?
It would, but it would start with the point of saying, open up the industry to other independent power producers. I would have thought that when that particular authorization was not given initially, the first point in which those individuals who were aggrieved would go to court and say to Eskom or say to the courts, we live in a free market economy. Our constitution allows us to engage in any single trade that you want to get into. And government can't use legislation to limit us in terms of doing that. But let's look at the preventative measures of what we want to prevent by doing this. We want to make sure that we are able to provide electricity to each and every South African. And if we can be regulated, we get that. But at the end of the day, allow us and give us this window in order to us to operate and be able to trade freely. Anyways, you are failing in doing that because over the past years, you haven't been able to provide electricity consistently due to your failures of not being able to manage Eskom of this number one entity, which is supposed to be the sole and only provider of electricity. And then go back and say, let us look at what happened and what caused all these inefficiencies to take place as Eskom so that you are able to hold people accountable. When you manage public funds, there's a certain manner in which you ought to do so, and the law is very clear in terms of the level of accountability. When you're a director or an executive director or even a non-executive director, which is a board member in any entity, the law is very clear as to what you ought to have done. And yet we are not holding any of the individuals that have been there before accountable, and we are simply accepting the situation as it is today.
So it's interesting, isn't it, also from a legal perspective, I don't know if you agree, that whenever the successive boards and CEOs and COOs have spoken, they keep saying, well, sorry, I found this mess here, and all I've done is try to fix it. So to try and find the root legally of who ultimately should bear the responsibility, the blame, would we have to go back necessarily as far back as the early to mid-2000s, do you think?
If it needs to, yes, you must. Let's remember your fiduciary duty is to say, I want to protect the interests of this entity. Protection is twofold. I want to protect it going forward. Secondly, I want to recover any of the funds that can be recovered at a later stage. If someone is benefited in a wrongful manner, in a manner that they ought to have not benefited in Eskom, it is the duty, the fiduciary duty of the executive directors that are there to make sure that they're able to collect those monies that were paid in a manner which is not correct or in line with our constitution, with our law. That is what they've done previously. And after the State Capture Commission, those money which were being paid back, that is part of the process and part of the fiduciary duties in which they've ought to have done so in the first place. But then you then say, moving forward, let me prevent this type of things from happening. Let me make sure that I'm able to update all the other entities and companies that are there and tell them the real truth that I can't fix this problem in 5 years or in 10 years. I'm going to need more time and I'm going to need more money. So you must start preparing yourself so that you're able to fit in and the economy is able to take pace, knowing very well as to what the economic conditions are going to be. By that I mean I as an entity providing maybe in a high electricity demanding environment, I must then be able to put into my contracts as part of force majeure blackouts so that at the end of the day I'm not forced to pay penalties for failure to act or act in line with the contract that I've signed with my service providers. Insurance entities will then have to come in terms of saying, don't exclude a fault which are going to occur due to Eskom or blackouts, or when the electricity comes back at a larger surge, then the equipment is broken, and then I have a problem at the end of the day. I can't claim from anyone. Those are type of things that must be discussed so that we're able to work better and understand each other as all the stakeholders that are there in this entity. If we all pull together and make sure that we pull our weight, then the impact would be maybe a bit lesser, but I'm sure that a solution will be found. But now what we are doing, it's as if we're in our own little silos and not pulling together using the law to force them to make sure that they make Eskom work.
And stand by for me, gentlemen, because after the break we'll talk more about why it is that we haven't even seen a class action lawsuit to try and hold Eskom and government accountable for the consistent failure to keep the lights on since 2008. We'll also talk about the DA's argument that the National Electricity Council that was set up to respond to this crisis has been ineffective. Stay with us. Welcome back. You're watching Newzroom Afrika tonight with a focus on news at Prime on the energy crisis in the country. We're joined by James Lorimer, the DA Shadow Minister for Mineral Resources, and Mpumelelo Zikalala is a legal analyst. Joining us via our video link, we also have Clyde Mallisson with me in studio, an energy expert. Gentlemen, let's pick up on some of the points that Mpumelelo was making before we went on the break, and I'll pick up with you, James. One of the issues that has to do with why there hasn't been a grander scale, shall we say, mass mobilization to hold government and Eskom management accountable for the crisis over the years. Why do you think we've not seen that?
This is the extraordinary thing, is the slow pace with which government has addressed what is an existential problem for the country's economy. And really, you have to ask yourself, well, what could it be? Is it massive incompetence? It's almost unbelievable that anybody could be so incompetent as to leave it for 14 years without properly addressing the problem. The other explanation is massive crookery, that there are people at the top who are benefiting from the situation as it is, and it's not in their interests to fix things. So you pays your money, you takes a choice. It's probably one or other, or possibly a combination of both. But there is no political will to fix this with the speed that it should be addressed.
And Clyde, the Energy Minister, again speaking this week, basically said that we need to understand these power cuts in the context of a global energy crisis, a shortage at this point. But when you look at the facts, does it really tie in with the scenarios in some of the other countries dealing with an energy shortage at the moment?
Not at all. I'm always amused at how we import problems from Europe and yet we don't import solutions from Europe, or when we compare it, convenient. To compare our energy crisis in South Africa at the moment, one of the countries in the world with the most abundant wind and solar and natural resources, with Europe, that where the poor guys take off their shirts when there's a sunny day once a year, living off a gas stream from Russia, to make a comparison there is to be so... It doesn't actually warrant a response, in my opinion.
And you were listening as we were speaking about the situation of the hospitals in the country at the moment. Healthcare workers saying hospitals need to be exempt from the vigor or the frequent load shedding in the country now, stage 5, 6, 1, 3, I think at the moment. One can barely keep up these days. Why was that not even something that we were able to get ahead of when you consider how crucial those services are?
Look, what really annoys me is that our system operator, the country, doesn't understand that electricity can be delivered at the speed of light, and we should make use of all the facilities in the system. So when we had our risk mitigation program, they said you have to put the batteries where the solar farms and the wind farms are. And I challenged that and said the storage, the pump storage, aren't next to the Eskom pump stations. What we should have done is said, if we're going to put batteries in, where are they going to be most useful? And I would have said, well, how about hospitals, clinics, schools, and they could all work. They would still be in the system, but they would be doing a dual role. They would be helping with stabilizing the system, in other words, storing surplus wind and solar, because remember, electricity travels at the speed of light. It's not logistics where you've got to wait for traffic lights. And they would have been taking schools, hospitals, clinics, mortuaries off of load shedding. But we didn't do that because we tend to work in funny little silos, and we don't understand that the energy system is a system in the best sense of the word. And so it's beyond me why we don't allow ourselves to look at systematic solutions to wicked problems.
So, James, given that then, even the lack of preparation around the scenario that Clyde is just pointing out, that, you've got health facilities which would have been most ideal for some of this planning, what do you see as the future role of Parliament and the portfolio committees in Parliament in making sure that even if there's a reconfigured Eskom leadership, even in Cabinet if there is to be a future reconfiguration, that it goes beyond just statements of condemnation and demands for accountability?
I think the best thing that Parliament could do would be to end the Eskom monopoly or the government monopoly on power. And one of the fastest solutions would be to open the electricity market to private players, much more than it is. I would like to see a situation where we just said, if you can produce power, however you can produce power, produce it for us. Government is not going to block you or regulate you. Take your risks in the market. Private enterprise, come on in. Because at the moment, everything is subject to government, and government has proved again and again that it just can't cope. It cannot deliver. And I have very little faith that it's going to suddenly turn around and fix Eskom and be able to produce power on its own. We need the private sector.
We'll come back to the role of the private sector in a moment. I want to bring back into the conversation Mpumelelo Zikalala, legal analyst, joining us for this discussion. Mpumelelo, one of the ideas that are growing in support, especially at least if you use online discussion, is a metric, shall we say, of a level of interest, has been around bringing back former Eskom executives who are embroiled in various controversies to do with its alleged destruction, well, its destruction, but their alleged role therein. Legally, how workable would that be to bring in someone, even though, yes, they may not necessarily be facing criminal charges, but have been found to have been involved in wrongdoing?
At the end of the day, you're bringing someone who has basically in one way or another failed to provide or act diligently towards their employment contract. So what makes you think that they're going to change in the manner in which they've been rendering their services previously? You can't do that if you haven't identified the problem. You would only go back to those instances if you are not clear as to what the problem is and you are not being able to provide workable solutions that can be able to bring immediate relief so that it is there. Now, what I think government is shying away from saying is to say, we need the help of private sector, we need it quickly and we need it faster, so that at the end of the day it's able to provide electricity at the rate in which the demand is in. Now, we can't wait as South Africans for so many years or 5 years while there are certain construction which is taking place so that they can add more power to the grid. We need solutions which are going to work now. But in bringing in those particular workers to Eskom or bringing them back, you have to think back and say, I did not fire this person by mistake, or they did not resign by mistake. It was due to inefficiencies that have taken place. It was due to non-compliance with certain legislation that they ought to have complied with. So in order for me to go back to them, I must take real persuasion to say they are going to provide the solutions that we really need right now. And I think South Africans are full of talents, and there are many individuals that you can get and then say, come and assist in terms of making sure that Eskom becomes great again and they're able to provide their services in a manner in which they ought to provide them in.
We spoke at length about holding the executive, past and current, accountable for the crisis in terms of the law, but on the issue of the inclusion of the private sector in a more larger role in energy provision in this country, is there space for a legal process to be brought by people, civil society, to force government's hand?
Definitely. You have your triple P, your private-public partnerships, which are there, recognized by the law, also recognized by Treasury as a mechanism of making sure that you're able to bridge the gap between the two. In fact, it would be more faster than going out in a, let's say, a procurement process and make sure that people are then recruited, because there are also sort of things that you need to comply with. But another thing that you can do is to simply say to them, let me open up the market to you. Yes, there may be regulation here and there so that you don't end up as a free-for-all, and there may be abuse that may take place, or even certain price fixing that may take place. But however, there is a competition commission that can be able to play an oversight role in that particular sphere. So there are mechanisms that can be utilized that are within our disposals. It's just that it needs the stakeholders to then say, let's work together and use these items or the tools that we have at our disposal, so that at the end of the day, we're able to provide electricity sooner than later.
Clyde, is it going to get a lot worse before it gets better?
I hope not, but I fear it probably will. But I want to just quickly say something very important. Cape Town, preemptively, 2 or 3 years ago, said, please let us build electricity. We see a problem coming preemptively, and they weren't allowed to. They took that to court. So if ever there were a case of we need to be working preemptively, not retroactively. And the best example I can think of is the city of Cape Town being blocked in courts by the minister to not be allowed to procure power 2 to 3 years ago. Correct me if I've got the date wrong.
James Lorimer, Eskom DA has been speaking, especially in the last 7 days, about what you called the declaration of ring-fenced state of disaster declaration around Eskom. What are the practicalities? And we've spoken a lot about the legalese tonight, but is that something that you would go as far as approaching a court to try and make happen?
Look, never say never, but that's, I don't think, one of our immediate plans. We want to put pressure at a political level to try and make government understand and try and make South Africans understand that the government cannot be both player and referee in the economy, which it's been trying to do, hugely unsuccessfully. What it should do is take a step back, regulate, and let the private sector deliver instead.
Private sector regulation. Just this week, Clyde, the energy minister once more was quite pleased at the signing of some of those agreements, saying, you know, they're getting the ball rolling. But what we need is more power on the grid as soon as tomorrow, Monday, next week. Is there anything that can actually make that happen?
The fastest is probably rooftop solar. That's the fastest thing. I don't hold out too much hope. As I said, we need to get the 100 or so key engineers from Eskom together and do a pact with them and say, can you squeeze X amount of these out of these old ladies for the next 10 years, and then give them a declining target rather than an impossible climbing target.
So is that 18 months to 2 years still realistic as far as targets go?
I think we could probably get some stuff done faster than that if we declared it as an emergency. But I've always been saying, let's acknowledge that it's a crisis and an emergency and avoid having to declare it as a state of disaster. I would argue that we don't have to declare a state of disaster anymore. We're actually in a state of disaster.
Gentlemen, thank you all for being on the program tonight. I was joined by James Lorimer, the DA's Shadow Minister for Mineral Resources, and Mpumelelo Zikalala, a legal analyst who was with us via the video link, and Clyde Mallisson, who's just been speaking, an energy expert, as we focus tonight on the country's energy crisis. Load shedding set to continue for another week. Stages 3 and 4 will be in effect. Check how you will be affected over the coming days.